I always thought I was lucky to have a son who took an interest in my work. I didn't find the life of a park ranger to be particularly glamorous, so when he started asking questions about my job, I was surprised. It wasn't long after that when we started camping together, going on hikes, and immersing ourselves in the wilderness. I shared my knowledge as best I could. I taught him how to spot tracks in the spring and summer. I taught him how to build a fire in the fall and winter. He was prepared, I thought, although I didn't know exactly what for. Maybe he'd follow in my footsteps and spend his weeks patrolling our nation's great national parks. Maybe he'd pass that knowledge down to his own kids when the time came. I was wrong about a lot of things. He wasn't prepared, not really, and neither of us were lucky. When the thing in the woods crossed our path, each of us realized just how dangerous these parks really are. There are no manuals, no amount of training, and no weapons that can prepare you for the secrets Mother Nature still hides. We were setting up camp. Dusk was fast approaching. We'd picked out a pretty clear spot surrounded by fir trees. There weren't any tracks nearby, and there were no signs of nesting, either in our area or in a 15-foot radius around our site. We thought we were in the clear. We'd be lucky to see a passing deer. Before we could even erect our tents, though, the knocking started. We listened at first, trying to silently decide if we were hearing something natural. Sometimes you'll hear a buck grinding their antlers against a smaller tree. This sound was more unique. It was rhythmic. There was an undeniable pattern to it, something intelligent. It wasn't Morse code, but it felt similar, like the distant knocks were speaking in a language that we just didn't know. So we called out. We went looking. My son was 13 and intelligent enough to hang back or to run if he needed to, but we were both convinced that we were hearing the efforts of a man or woman stuck in the area nearby. They could have been trapped, injured, or malnourished. They couldn't speak, that much was clear, but we believed they were asking for help. The average person wouldn't know Morse code. They'd just be making whatever noises they could to get somebody's attention. They had our attention at least, but they weren't human. We agreed on the direction the sounds were coming from, and we moved toward it. After walking maybe a dozen feet outside of our camp's perimeter, the knocking abruptly ended. We heard something scrape past the trees, like thick fur tangling in dry branches. That sound passed us like birds on the wind, quick and fluttering. We tried to turn our heads and follow the sounds as they ran around us, but we couldn't make out the shape of whatever was out there. It was moving too quickly to be a man. We stood back to back, turning in a circle to keep our eyes on the woods. I remember seeing goosebumps on my son's arms. They matched the hairs standing up on my own neck. We both felt the same way. We'd stumbled into a trap of some kind. We were being hunted. Our only chance, I thought, was to make ourselves look big. Don't show any fear. Make it look like the meat on our bones wouldn't be worth the fight. Then my son spotted the thing in the trees. He screamed and pointed. My eyes followed his finger. It was twice the size of either of us. Approaching 8 feet tall with a hunch in its back that meant it was probably even taller, standing on 2 feet. Covered in the exact fur that I had imagined, thick and matted and the color of the autumn leaves, I'd never seen an animal so wide. My son and I standing shoulder to shoulder barely matches the width of its chest. It stood there, half hidden by the fur, and just watched. It glared at us, chewing on its lip like a daydreaming child. Its brow jutted out, and its forehead was tall and narrow. It looked like an ape of some kind. Its long arms nearly scraped the ground, even from its upright position. It was hard not to imagine those arms tearing through the trees around us. Our bodies would break even easier than that. It took in one more big breath, filling its lungs to the brim. I flinched when I thought it might roar. But then, the beast turned and ran away. It disappeared back into the woods, leaving both of us with wide eyes and open mouths. That was the first time my son asked a question about the woods that I couldn't answer. That was the first time I even considered that we might be in danger out there in the trees. How could we prepare for that? How could we sleep soundly, knowing that it was out there watching us? That night, we didn't. We packed up and drove all night to crawl back into our own beds. We haven't gone camping since either. We haven't visited the trails. Unfortunately for me, I haven't seen the beast again, even after volunteering for more work with the parks. I wanted to get a picture of it. I wanted to have evidence that someone could point to and proclaim, "I know what that is." After that, I figured I might feel safe again. I might go back out there with my kid. The woods might be our special place again, but I'm starting to think that will never happen. There are no answers for these kinds of things, are there? There's no one coming along to explain what we encountered. We heard the howling for weeks. Before that, it was the shrieking of our chickens at 4 in the morning. The animals always heard it coming long before we did. We learned to listen for those chickens. We listened for the cows in their stalls. We listened for our old bloodhound, who would anxiously pace the halls with one eye glued to the front door. We always thought that was funny. Whatever it was outside, we never expected it to come through the front door. We never expected it to come to the house at all. That shows how little we knew, huh? The howling started in the summer, early June. It was so far away the first night that we mistook it for the wind. We thought a dry thunderstorm might be coming in from the west, the same direction as the forest at the edge of our farmland. When the wind and thunder ripples through those trees, the forest makes all sorts of unholy sounds. We thought the howls were the same sort, terrifying in nature but harmless in reality. That was another mistake. Each night the sounds got closer. On the first night, our hound had merely pointed her ears toward the window. The next night she faced the glass and growled. Then the pacing began. By that third night, it was as the thunder had descended on just our farm. The howls were deafening. They occurred so late in the night that we had no hopes of preparing for them. We tried to stay up to spot whatever was out there for ourselves, but each time our old age caught up to us and lulled us to a bitter sleep. 4 a.m., almost like clockwork, we'd wake to a disturbance. We'd run to the door, sometimes armed and sometimes not, rushing into the porch to yell at our mysterious intruder. They were always gone. The bestial shrieking would always end the moment we opened the door. The cows would murmur and quiet down. The chickens would clean their feathers. What could we do, we wondered? How could we trap this thing? How could we get our eyes on it in order to understand just what we were dealing with? We didn't come up with any genius plan. We hired back one of our old farmhands, a sturdy boy with a military past that he rarely spoke about. We described what we were dealing with, and he agreed to sit up on our porch, waiting for the beast to come. We thought that would settle it. We knew he was a crack shot with a rifle. We knew he wouldn't scare easy. That night the howling was louder than ever before. It wasn't loud enough to hide that man screaming. While the howl was low and as smooth as the breeze, our farmhand's cries were sharp, piercing, and erratic. He was attacked. We were sure of it. No man would scream like that unless they were being ripped apart. When we joined him on the porch, however, it was clear that the man was in one piece. As before, when we opened the door, the invader fled. Our guard stood trembling on the porch, skin as white as bone and eyes as wide as a flower in the sun. It didn't make sense to us then, but he was rambling about a man. We thought whatever he'd seen must have triggered some dormant memories from his time in the military. There was no way that the howling we'd heard was made by a human being. That was our last night with a guard on our porch. We recommitted ourselves in that moment to spot the creature on our own. As terrified as our farmhand was, we were relieved to know that thus far the monster had yet to attack any of our livestock. Initially, we wanted to protect our land. We wanted to repel the invader. Something about the farmhand's encounter steered us closer toward morbid curiosity. We didn't think we were in danger. We just wanted to know. We wanted to solve the mystery that had rolled across our farm like a cloud of fog. We sat on our porch with a pot of coffee and a checkers board between us. We made it to 2 a.m. We woke yet again to the ruckus. This time, the fence around our chickens was groaning and spitting, bending and breaking under some immense pressure. We chased the sound. The howling was a whimper. When we finally cornered it, we saw the beast was snared by the fractured ends of our own fence. The farm itself had caught the invader, not us. Now its arm was pinned by 2 planks of snapped wood. We had spent weeks waiting for this moment, and now that it was upon us, we were as insignificant as the hens anxiously pattering on the other side of the fence. The beast was in front of us. Now what? We were baffled for one simple reason. The farmhand had been right. We were looking at a man. His back was engorged, swollen, and curved to the point that his spine appeared to be shaped like a scythe. From head to toe, he was covered in thin, wiry fur. He snarled when he looked at us. Spit ran from his lips to his chin. His teeth were pointed, more canine than primate. What were we looking at? We raised our rifle and took aim. We had to be rid of this beast after all. Then, behind us, true thunder finally cracked in the cruelest dry storm of the season. It cracked like a whip, and we jumped out of our skin expecting there to be another monster behind us. We turned, misfired the weapon, and stumbled. The beast tore itself free. It ran. We fired another shot but missed. It stayed away from our farm after that. Our hound still paces the hallways when the summer rolls in. But we haven't heard the howl in years. What about you, I wonder? Have you heard anything like this before? Have you seen it? This is a short story about something strange that happened in our house, and I'm really curious to hear what you make of it. So, my partner, Alice, and I, we live in this pretty old house in a residential neighborhood of Missouri. It's one of those houses that has seen a fair share of decades and has some pretty interesting architectural details, you know? It's got these tall ceilings and these big, old-fashioned windows, and it just oozes character. Anyway, we live on the ground floor. That's going to matter later. So about 6 months after we moved in, we were getting the place ready for Christmas. You should know, Alice and I, we're big on holidays. We love the whole shebang, decorating the tree, hanging stockings, the works. One evening we were watching some Christmas movies on the TV. You know, those Hallmark ones that are just the right kind of cheesy. It was getting late, around 9 p.m., so we decided to switch off the porch light and head to bed. Now our house, it's got this quaint little foyer right as you enter. There's a staircase on the right that leads up to our neighbor's place, and our front door is just across from the main entrance. And then there's this door next to the staircase that leads to the cellar. When we first moved in, Alice and I had taken a look at the cellar. It was pretty spacious and old with all these corners and crevices. The cellar door, it's got this old latch on it, one of those that you have to slide and fit into a groove. We always keep it locked unless the landlord tells us that someone's coming for maintenance. So on this particular Christmas Eve, Alice and I were heading to bed when we hear the main door into the foyer creak open. It was odd because our neighbors were away for the holidays and the door was locked. Alice went over and peeked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. We shrugged it off as maybe just the wind or something and went back to bed. But then, just as we were about to turn in, we noticed that the cellar door was ajar. Just a little, maybe an inch or so. But it was strange. It was locked when Alice checked the foyer earlier. We decided to check it out, just to be on the safe side. The cellar was empty and cold, just as it should be. We locked the door again and went back to bed. The next morning, when we were heading out for a walk, we noticed the cellar door was open again. Alice was sure she had locked it. She even texted our neighbor asking if they had come down for some reason. But they were still away, remember? They made some joke about us having a Christmas ghost. We tried to laugh it off and went about our day, but that night the cellar door was wide open again, and I mean so wide open that it was blocking our front door. Both of us a little freaked out, we decided to check the cellar again, but it was empty. We've checked multiple times since then and haven't found anything or anyone. But every single night, no matter how tightly we lock it or what we put in front of it, the cellar door just keeps opening. Maybe our neighbors were onto something with their ghost joke. because there's no way for the latch to just pop open on its own. We're hoping that once our landlord puts a proper lock on the door, this all stops. But if it doesn't, well, I guess I'll be writing to you again with an update. I mean, if it is a ghost, I hope it's a friendly one. Given the holiday season and all, a ghost of Christmas past, maybe? Anyway, fingers crossed, right? So here's a thing that happened to me when I was just a kid. We were living in this tiny place in Nevada, not too far from Nellis Air Force Base. Our house was on the west side of town, and there was this big desert area right behind our backyard. Kind of cool place for a kid, you know? My friends and I used to spend hours out there, chasing lizards and pretending to be explorers. Anyway, one evening, my dad had just come home from work, and I heard him call out to me from the yard. His voice had this weird tone. I was the eldest, and my younger siblings were already in bed, so I was wondering what's up. I could feel that he was uneasy about something more than just needing help with his toolbox. My first thought was that he'd spotted a rattlesnake or something, because we'd been seeing them around lately. So I rushed outside, and he pointed at something that was hovering over the desert area, kind of southwest of our house. He was like, "Can you make out what that thing is?" You see, I was pretty familiar with all sorts of aircraft. My grandpa had been taking me to every air show possible since I was just a kid, and my uncle worked as an engineer at Boeing. But this thing my dad was pointing at, it was making a sound like a far-off lawnmower. Not at all the kind of sound you'd expect from a helicopter hovering at that distance. I had seen my fair share of helicopters, and this wasn't one of them. And we lived around planes, both civilian and military. This thing was not moving, and it looked to be about the size of a school bus. It was hard to make out its exact shape, but I could swear it was circular, and it had this weird glow. The light was a soft blue, and it was flickering almost like it was breathing. It reminded me of the way a flashlight's beam dances on the wall of a dark room. It just hung there in the air, as if it was spotlighting something beneath it. After we watched it for a few minutes, it began to drift slowly. The noise got a bit louder, but not as much as you'd expect from something that big that was hovering and moving slowly. The thing followed the course of the desert, west. It passed close to our house, and then we lost sight of it as it drifted behind a sand dune. We walked around the south side of the house to try and catch sight of it again as it crossed the last few houses in our street. We saw it follow the desert path, about 50, 60 feet above the ground. It still wasn't making a lot of noise. But then, just like that, in the blink of an eye, the light went from in front of us to hovering over the neon lights of Las Vegas, way off in the distance. A quick Google search will tell you that's over 30 miles. The crazy thing is, at that point, there was no noise at all. It was just silent. Yet it had accelerated instantly. It covered those 30-something miles in the fraction of a second. We watched it the whole time, not believing what we were seeing. It then hovered over the city for about half a second. Then it shot straight up at the same speed it had crossed the desert. And then we lost sight of it in the night sky as it ascended straight up. The stars are always bright at night in that part of Nevada. I remember as it went up, it lost that glow and changed to a bright blue that got brighter and brighter. It kind of looked like a firework that didn't explode, but it went much higher and faster. The next morning on the school bus, I told the kids from the end of our street about what my dad and I had seen. They all laughed at me, and I was the joke for the next couple of days. I was kind of a weird kid, you know, more into books and stargazing than sports. The subject didn't come up again until maybe a year later, when I got a bit more popular and ended up being friends with one of those kids. Turned out, he and his family had seen the same thing, but he had been too embarrassed to admit it in front of the others on the bus, especially after the way they had all reacted. His parents had even told him not to talk about it because people would think they were crazy. This was all back in the late 90s. I went on to study aerospace engineering and have had the chance to work on some classified projects involving aircraft and other military tech. Even spent some time as an analyst in the U.S. Air Force, focusing on studying equipment imagery, understanding their functions and capabilities, and providing that information for operational needs. And let me tell you, nothing moves like that thing moved. Nothing we have, nothing anyone has. I know some will choose to believe me, and others won't. I'm certain about what I saw, but I don't think I'll ever get a satisfactory explanation for my encounter. In the heart of the bustling city, I had an encounter that forever altered my perception of urban life. I was around 13 or 14 at the time, living in a high-rise apartment in New York City. Every summer, my parents would send me to a week-long summer camp in the city's eastern district. The camp was an urban adventure theme, offering activities like rock climbing, archery, group games, and rooftop sing-alongs. The camp had 3 types of accommodations. The first was the penthouse suites, reserved for the older kids. The second was the loft apartments, akin to large open spaces with high ceilings. The third was the rooftop tents where I was staying. The rooftop tent was a single-room structure, perched on the top of a high-rise building, surrounded by a 3-foot barrier to prevent anyone from falling off. It was open to the elements, but a slanted canvas roof protected us from rain. Each accommodation was about a quarter-mile apart, giving a sense of seclusion. Our group consisted of a counselor and about 6 kids. On the last night of camp, I was struggling to fall asleep. The city lights were unusually bright, and the sounds of the city were more noticeable than ever. I lay there lost in my thoughts, when I began to notice a distinct sound that gradually became more distinguishable from the usual city noises. It sounded like faint rustling, but as the sound grew closer, I could tell that something was moving across the rooftops. I started listening closer, feeling a little nervous. The sound was getting progressively louder, and it started sounding like the noise was being made by the footsteps of a person rather than an animal. It was approaching from the south, which led towards the depths of the city, instead of from the north, where the camp facilities were located. That definitely made me think that it wasn't a counselor or someone coming to alert us of something. When I realized that, my curiosity changed to fear. I tried to roll over as quietly as I could to sit up and take a look over the barrier. As I did, I heard a slight rustling sound coming from my left. The other kids were still asleep, but I saw that the counselor who was sleeping with us in the rooftop tent was awake. He had rolled over in his cot to grab my attention when he saw that I was about to get up. He held up his hand to signal me to stop as soon as we made eye contact. I did what he told me and laid back down. I was just holding my breath and listening as hard as I could. The footsteps had stopped, which made me even more nervous since I had no idea where the thing was. Then I heard a strange sound that was like flapping. The counselor got out of his cot as quietly as he could, and I couldn't help myself. I followed him. As soon as we looked over the barrier, we saw this bizarre creature swoop out of the sky and land on the rooftop below us. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen or heard of before. It was tall, dark, and winged, with glowing red eyes that shone in the darkness. It was like me and the counselor were just frozen there. And as we were staring down, the creature looked up and locked eyes with me. I don't know how to explain it, but I almost felt as if it had been seeking me out specifically. The creature didn't move, and it was like it was just studying us with this piercing gaze that felt like it went right through us. The silence then was almost deafening, and I was barely breathing, waiting for it to make its next move. And then it spread its wings and took off, soaring up into the city's skyline and disappearing in the darkness. We were basically just paralyzed with fear and didn't know what to do next. We stayed huddled in the rooftop tent for the rest of the night. There was no way we were going to venture anywhere not knowing where that thing had gone, and we didn't want to wake up the others and have a full-blown panic going on. At least it was only a couple hours until sunrise. And when it got light enough and everyone woke up, the counselor just calmly as possible herded us all to where the main camp was and settled us in the dining area. He ordered us to stay put while he went and talked to the camp director. The other kids didn't know what was going on, and I just did not want to talk about it at all. There was such a weird mood in the camp that morning while we waited for our parents to pick us up. It was a complete contrast to the usual last-day shenanigans that would usually be going on. I don't know what the counselors told the parents. I did tell my mom and dad what I had seen. It's hard to know what they really thought. From that day on, I never looked at the city in the same way again. I had experienced something that hardly anyone would believe, and it really changed me.